Good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. On October 26th, 2009, I woke up from a 34-day coma after undergoing a double lung transplant. 6 years before that, I was starting my career as an opera singer in Europe when I was diagnosed with idiopathic pulmonary arterial hypertension, or PH, which is caused when there's a thickening in the endothelial lining of the lung, making it difficult to absorb oxygen and causing what I affectionately call the reverse Grinch effect. My heart was 3.5 times too big. I went to a top specialist who told me I had to stop singing. She said, "Those high notes are going to kill you." But thankfully, I met Dr. Redigergis, who thought it was fine for me to sing, but it meant making some other trade-offs in my life. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, at a mile high with 10 brothers and sisters, but the altitude exacerbated my symptoms. So I moved to sea level. I stopped eating salt. I couldn't exercise like I used to. I started on a medical trial, and I started taking huge amounts of Viagra. After 6 months, they did a heart catheterization to measure pulmonary arterial pressures that were supposed to be between 15 and 25. Mine were 146, and it meant I needed to go on the big gun drug for PH, which at the time was called Flolan. And Flolan is more than a drug. It's really a way of life. Doctors attach a catheter to the chest, which is attached to a pump that weighs about 5 pounds. And for the rest of my life, with PH, I would be attached to that pump 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I would spend hours managing and mixing the medication every day. There were a lot of symptoms involved with the medication, and it was also relatively unstable. So if a bubble of air got into the cartridge when you were mixing, you could die. If you went through a metal detector, you could die. If you ran out of medicine, you'd definitely die. And if you ate some salt, like maybe a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you might not die, but it could land you in the ICU for a few days. No one wanted to go on Flolan, but when I needed it, it was a godsend. Within a few days, I was walking again. Within a few weeks, I was performing, and in a few months, I debuted at the Kennedy Center. I found my pump somewhat problematic when I'd perform. The tubing coming out of my chest was a nightmare for costume designers, and I'd attach it to my inner thigh with the help of a pair of Spanx and an ace bandage. Countless elevator rides were spent stuffing my pump into my Spanx, hoping the doors weren't going to open unexpectedly. And at that point, my life was kind of like the happy parts of an opera. Complicated, but in a good way. Then in 2008, my father and grandfather died 2 months apart. It was emotionally and physically devastating, sending my health into a downward spiral. I returned to the United States and landed in the ER with an epic set of cankles, or swollen ankles. They were really disgusting. And it was right heart failure. I needed a lung transplant and somewhat resistantly went on to the list. The average wait time at that point was 1,000 days, and so I thought I would have some time to adjust to this idea. But the next morning, we got a call. The policies had just changed, and transplants were doled out due to need, not time on the list. And I was number one. My family raced to the hospital in hopes of meeting me in time to say what we knew might be our final goodbye, but organs don't wait. And I went into surgery alone. The last thing I remember was being wheeled in to the operating room on a warm white blanket and meeting my surgeon, Ken McCurry, for the first time. I explained to him that I had to see my mother again, and if there was anything that he could do to save my voice, I asked that he please do it. With that, I was out. Over the next 13 and a half hours, I flatlined twice. 40 pints of blood were infused into my body. I was on every form of life support available. And when my extraordinarily skilled surgeon finally emerged from the operating room, he explained to my poor mother that it was too late. It was unlikely I would survive, and in his 20 years of practice, this was the second most challenging surgery he'd ever performed. I spent the next 34 days in an apocalyptic dream world. When I woke up, there were a dozen tubes coming in and out of my body. I weighed 95 pounds. I couldn't walk, talk, eat, move, or breathe. But when I saw my mom, and I realized I was alive, I couldn't help but smile. It would be 2 months before I could breathe on my own, and it would be another month before I started to relearn to walk. But on December 30th, 2009, I went home. Shortly thereafter, I decided that I was going to try and sing. It was not pretty, and I was making other plans when my mother agreed that I would go back and sing for my doctors. And I knew that if for nothing else, I needed to do it for her. I started singing again every day and practicing. And by the time the performance came along, I was excited. When I got there, there were 1,000 people in the audience. And when I was done, they went wild, despite the fact that it was not my most technically perfect performance. And soon the story had gone viral. I was fielding invitations from San Francisco to Spain. It was really exciting, but I didn't want to jinx anything, so I took flu season off. Somehow I contracted an infection, which spiraled into full-fledged chronic rejection. My lungs were irreparably damaged. There was this whole process of anger and grief, denial and fear. But at the end of the day, I still had a life that I was going to live. I continued to perform across the country, and in April of 2011, I received an invitation to debut at Lincoln Center. And this wasn't just any debut. I'd be headlining alongside some of my musical heroes, legends in their own right. I became entirely focused on one goal, getting there. But as the weeks turned to months, the rejection progressed at an increasing clip. Soon, I could do little more than sit in my apartment and try to breathe. Inexplicably, I could still sing. So once a day, I'd take off my oxygen, pull myself up to full stature, belt out the aria from La Traviata that I was slated to sing, and then return to the arduous task of breathing. About 10 days before the performance, I realized that it was going to be impossible for me to get there in my current condition. I called my doctor and I explained the situation to her, and and she said to come in. She wasn't sure if she could do anything, but she would try. Within a few days, I wasn't well, but I was well enough that doctors were discussing discharge, and they decided to let me out in time to make it to my performance. We arrived at the stage door just in time for the dress rehearsal. The next night, as I was waiting in the wings, I thought about the previous week when this moment seemed all but impossible. I thought about my father and my grandfather, about my mother, my brothers and sisters, and all of the sacrifices they had made to help me get to this point. I thought about my doctors and my nurses, about my friends and my donor whose death had brought me life and whose lungs I was rejecting. It was a miracle, but it wasn't just one. There were 1,001 miracles which had paved this most unlikely of paths. I heard the orchestra begin to play my introduction. I took off my oxygen, stood up from my wheelchair, walked onto stage, and began to sing. For that moment, the world was more than I could have ever hoped for. I was free, and I sang with a power I didn't realize I still possessed. When I finished, the audience went wild, and I did everything I could to keep it together. But as I collapsed into my wheelchair, tears were streaming down my face because I knew whether I lived or died, I had just shared the greatest performance of my life in the greatest concert hall in the world. That night, my body tingled with excitement. Maybe it was just the steroids. I was on a lot of them at the time. I don't know. I don't really care. I was just so happy. But all too soon, the reality of my situation became unavoidable. I married the love of my life, and my condition became impossible to maintain at home. I went into the ICU, or the emergency room, on Christmas Eve of 2011 with blood pressure that was like 220 over 200. My spirometry didn't even register. I was airlifted to the Cleveland Clinic, where I was on a list for a transplant, and I knew lungs would come. But days passed after months and months before that passing with not so much as a false alarm. On New Year's Eve, shortly after the ball dropped, welcoming 2012, I called to my family. I felt the sense of impending doom, and I told them I loved them so much, but that this was my time. With that, I blacked out. That night, I was intubated. Doctors paralyzed my body in hopes that it would sync my breathing with the respirator, but nothing seemed to work. The surgeon on call told my mother it was time to gather the family around and to say goodbye, but she refused to do anything until my surgeon returned. When he did, I was placed on ECMO, which is probably the most advanced form of life support that exists. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but if you're not, there are two tubes, and in one tube, it takes all of the blood out of the body, and the other tube brings it all back in, and when it brings it in, it's oxygenated because my lungs had failed to function. After days of this, my doctor realized I wouldn't survive if I wasn't stronger. So my surgeon introduced a new protocol. People don't really move on ECMO, they usually die on it, but he had me moving, exercising, even walking while I was on this extremely delicate machine. But as the weeks wore on, I knew the situation was untenable. I didn't see a path out of the hospital. Then one morning we got a call. It was a miracle. It was a match. as I was rolled into the operating room, I squeezed my mother's hand and my husband's hand on the other side, and I told them, "We've done this once, we can do this again. I love you." Because this time I knew I would live, and that someday I would sing, and somehow, this time, it would be easier. 2 months after that very dark night, which I thought was my last in the hospital, I was showing real signs of improvement. I was off of the respirator. I was in a step-down unit, on my way out of the hospital. One night after rounds, my surgeon came in. He's not a man of many words, unlike me. I talk a lot. But he obviously had something he wanted to share. He said, "Charity, when I was a kid, my heroes were the astronauts. They were doing things that no one had ever done before. They went to the moon. In my line of work, we are judged on whether we make the safest choice. But I judge myself on whether I do what I know is right. And if I think I can save someone's life through a transplant, even if I have to try something that no one has ever done before, I'm going to do it. Because moving the horizon of science, of anything forward, isn't about making the safest choice. It's not about making the easiest choice. And sometimes it means failing miserably. But if we never try, we'll never know what we could have accomplished." I would have never thought that the theaters I perform in have anything to do with the medical theater and the operating theater. But there's more there than I had previously thought. There's a lot of blood. One place it's real, one place it's fake, but who's counting? There's a lot of drama. There's a lot of failure and death. But the heroes inevitably push past social convention and their own perceived inadequacies to push the horizon of possibility forward. When protocol hit a dead end, my doctor, my surgeon, and my mother forged a new path. When a family in Ohio faced a devastating tragedy, they looked towards hope, saving my life and many others in the process. When my body had given up, a whole cast of characters rallied around me. And instead of letting my sad finale peter out, they pushed me towards my next scene. When we put fear aside, the impossible comes in to reach. The blind will see, the lame will walk, and some of us might even sing.